how God's power works through our weaknesses. In the second book of Corinthians chapter 12 verse 9, the Apostle Paul shares a powerful message that is both personal and universal. He recounts a conversation with God, where he receives a divine response about weakness and grace. In the midst of his struggles, Paul learns a profound truth about God's sufficiency and power. This passage is not just a theological statement, but an invitation for believers to trust in God's grace when faced with difficulties. "My grace is sufficient for you." Paul had been pleading with God to remove a thorn in the flesh, a hardship or suffering he faced. But God responded not by removing the struggle, but by assuring him that his grace would be enough. The phrase "my grace is sufficient for you" speaks of God's ability to provide what is needed, even in times of weakness. God's grace is not just a comfort, it's the power that enables us to endure trials and live victoriously. God's grace goes beyond mere forgiveness of sins. It's the strength and favor he gives us to face life's challenges. In moments of weakness, God's grace is all-sufficient. It covers our inadequacies, helps us endure, and empowers us to accomplish his will. As we face trials, we are reminded that God's grace is available to sustain us. And God is able to bless you abundantly, so that in all things at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work. This reinforces the idea that God's grace provides everything we need for every situation. "For my power is made perfect in weakness." For my power is made perfect in weakness. This statement flips worldly wisdom on its head. In a world that exalts strength, power, and self-sufficiency, God declares that his power is perfected in weakness. When we are weak, we are more open to receiving God's strength. Our vulnerability allows his divine power to shine brightly. Human weakness is not a barrier to experiencing God's power. In fact, it is the conduit through which his power is fully expressed. When we acknowledge our limitations, we create space for God's strength to take center stage. This isn't about minimizing or hiding our struggles, but about recognizing that God's power is most evident when we are at our lowest. Isaiah 40 verse 29. He gives strength to the weary and increases the power of the weak. This verse highlights how God strengthens those who acknowledge their weakness, showing his power in the process. Boasting in weakness. "Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me." After receiving this revelation, Paul shifts his perspective. Rather than hiding his weaknesses, he chooses to boast about them. This is not pride in weakness, but in the fact that it makes room for God's power. Paul's boasting becomes an act of surrender, acknowledging that he does not need to rely on his strength, but on God's power working through his weaknesses. Boasting in weakness is a paradox. In a culture that values self-reliance, Paul's attitude is countercultural. He rejoices in his weaknesses because he understands that it is in those moments that Christ's power rests upon him. It's an invitation to embrace vulnerability, knowing that God's grace and power are made most visible in our humility and dependence on him. Philippians 4 verse 13. "I can do all this through him who gives me strength." This verse echoes Paul's understanding that it is through God's strength, not his own, that he can overcome and thrive. Second book of Corinthians chapter 12 verse 9 is a transformative verse for believers. It challenges us to rethink how we view our weaknesses and struggles. Rather than avoiding or hiding them, we are encouraged to embrace them as opportunities for God's power to be revealed. God's grace is always sufficient, and his power is perfected when we are weak. In our limitations, we can experience his strength, and through our weakness, we bring glory to God.